Chapter 8. Adventures at Blarney. It was getting on toward evening when we caught our train on the main line at Gould's Cross. The storm had swept southward, and the hills there were masked with rain, but the golden veil had emerged from its baptism, more lush, more green, more dazzling than ever. We left it behind at last, plunged into a wood of lofty and magnificent trees, and paused at Limerick Junction, with its great echoing train shed and wide network of tracks and switches. Beyond the junction, one gets from the train a splendid view of the picturesque Galtees, the highest mountains in the south of Ireland, fissured and gullied and folded into deep ravines in the most romantic way. The train had been comparatively empty thus far, and we had rejoiced in a compartment to ourselves. But as we drew into the station at Charleville, we were astonished to see a perfect mob of people crowding the platform, with more coming up every minute. The instant the train stopped, the mob snatched open the doors and swept into it like a tidal wave. When the riot subsided a bit, we found that 4 men and 2 girls were crowded in with us, and the corridor outside was jammed with people standing up. We asked the cause of the excitement, and were told that there had been a race meeting at Charleville, which had attracted a great crowd from all over the southeastern part of Ireland, especially from Cork, 35 miles away. Our companions soon got to chaffing each other, and it developed that all of them, even the 2 girls, had been betting on the races, and I inferred that they had all lost every cent they had. It was assumed as a matter of course that nobody would go to a race meeting without putting something on the horses. It was also assumed that every normal man and woman would make almost any sacrifice to get to a meeting, and there was a lively discussion as to possible ways and means of attending another meeting, which was to be held somewhere in the neighbourhood the following week. And finally, it was apparent that everybody present had contemplated the world through the bottom of a glass more than once that day. As I looked at them and listened to them, I began to understand the cause of at least a portion of Irish poverty. It was a good-humoured crowd, in spite of its reverses, and when a girl with the tambourine piped up a song, she was loudly encouraged to go on, and even managed to collect a few pennies, found unexpectedly in odd pockets. Then one of the men in our compartment told a story. I have forgotten what it was about, but it was received uproariously, and then everybody talked at once as loud as possible, and the clatter was deafening. We were glad when we got to Cork. Cork is superficially a sort of smaller Dublin. It has one handsome thoroughfare, approached by a handsome bridge, and the rest of the town is composed for the most part of dirty lanes between ugly houses. In Dublin, the principal street and bridge are dedicated to O'Connell. In Cork, both bridge and street are named after St. Patrick. That is about the only difference, except that Cork lacks that atmosphere of charm and culture which makes Dublin so attractive. We took a stroll about the streets that Saturday night after dinner and found them thronged with people, as at Dublin. But here there was a large admixture of English soldiers and sailors come up from Queenstown to celebrate. Many of them had girls on their arms, and those who had not were evidently hoping to have, and the impression one got was that Cork suffers a good deal from the evils of a garrison town. There is a tradition that the girls of Cork are unusually lovely, but I fear it is only a tradition. Or perhaps the lovely ones stay at home on Saturday night. Sunday dawned clear and bright, and as soon as we had breakfasted, we set out for the most famous spot in the vicinity of Cork, and perhaps in all Ireland, Blarney Castle. Undoubtedly the one Irish tradition which is known everywhere is that of the Blarney stone. Blarney itself has passed into the language as a noun, an adjective, and a verb, and the old tower of which the stone is a part has been pictured so often that its appearance is probably better known than that of any other ruin in Europe. Blarney is about 5 miles from Cork, and the easiest way of getting there is by the light railway, which runs close beside a pretty stream in which, this bright morning, many fishermen were trying their luck. And at last, high above the trees, we saw the rugged keep, which is all that is left of the old castle. Almost at once, the train stopped at the station, which is just outside the entrance to the castle grounds. The groves of Blarney are still charming, though they have changed greatly since the day when Richard Millican wrote his famous song in praise of them. There were grottos and beds of flowers, and terraces and rustic bowers there then, and statues of heathen gods and nymphs so fair all standing naked in the open air. But misfortune overtook the castle's owner, and the muses shed a tear when the cruel auctioneer, with his hammer in his hand, to sweet Blarney came. So the statues vanished, together with the grottos and the terraces. But the sweet silent brook still ripples through the grounds, and its banks are covered with daisies and buttercups, and guarded by giant beeches. Very lovely it is, so that one loiters to watch the dancing water, even with Blarney Castle close at hand. Approached thus, the massive dungeon tower, set on a cliff and looming 120 feet into the air, is most impressive. To the left is a lower and more ornamental fragment of the old castle, which, in its day, was the strongest in all Munster. Cormac McCarthy built it in the 15th century as a defence against the English, and it was held by the Irish until Cromwell's army besieged and captured it. Around the top of the tower is a series of machicolations, or openings between supporting corbels, through which the besieged in the old days could drop stones and pour molten lead and red-hot ashes and such like things down upon the assailants. And it is in the sill of one of these openings that the famous Blarney stone is fixed. Legend has it that, once upon a time, in the spring of the year when the waters were running high, Cormac McCarthy was returning home through the blackness of the night, and when he put his horse at the last ford, he thought for a moment he would be swept away, so swift and deep was the current. But his horse managed to keep its feet, and just as it was scrambling out upon the farther bank, McCarthy heard a scream from the darkness behind him, and then a woman's voice crying for help. So he dashed back into the stream, and after a fearful struggle, dragged the woman to safety. In the dim light, McCarthy could see only that she was old and withered, but her eyes gleamed like a cat's when she looked at him, and she called down blessings upon him for his courage, and bade him when he got home go out upon the battlement and kiss a certain stone, whose location she described to him. Thereupon she vanished, and so McCarthy knew it was a witch he had rescued. Next morning he went out upon the battlement and found the stone and kissed it, and thereafter was endowed with an eloquence so sweet and persuasive that no man or woman could resist it. Such is the legend, and it may have had its origins in the soft Delutheran speeches with which Dermot McCarthy put off the English when they called upon him to surrender his castle. Certain it is that it was fixed finally and firmly in the popular mind by the stanza which Father Prout added to Milligan's song. There is a stone there, that whoever kisses, oh, he never misses to grow eloquent. 'Tis he may clamber to a lady's chamber, or become a member of Parliament. A clever spouter he'll sure turn out, or an out and outer, to be let alone. Don't hope to hinder him, or to bewilder him. Sure he's a pilgrim from the Blarney Stone. And ever since then, troops of pilgrims have thronged to Blarney to kiss the stone. The top of the tower is reached by a narrow staircase, which goes round and round in the thickness of the wall, with narrow loopholes of windows here and there looking out upon the beautiful country, and a door at every level giving access to the great square interior. The floors have all fallen in, and there is only the blue sky for roof, but the graceful old fireplaces still remain, and some traces of ornamentation, and the ancient walls, 18 feet thick in places, and with mortar as hard as the rock, are wonderful to see. And finally you come out upon the battlemented parapet, with miles and miles of Ireland at your feet. But it wasn't to gaze at the view we had come to Blarney Castle, it was to kiss the stone, and we went at once to look for it. It was easy enough to find, for, on top of the battlement above it, a row of tall iron spikes has been set, and the stone itself is tied into the wall by iron braces. For one of Cromwell's cannonballs almost dislodged it, and it is worn and polished by the application of thousands of lips. But to kiss it, well, that is another story. For the sill, of which the stone forms a part, is some 2 feet lower than the level of the walk around the parapet, and to get to it, there is a horrid open space some 3 feet wide to span, and below that open space is a sheer drop of 120 feet to the ground below. When one looks down through it, all that one can see are the waving treetops far, far beneath. There is just one way to accomplish the feat, and that is to lie down on your back while somebody grasps your ankles, and then permit yourself to be shoved backward and downward across the abyss until your mouth is underneath the sill. Betty and I looked at the stone, and at the yawning chasm, and then at each other. And then we went away and sat down in a corner of the battlement to think it over. We had supposed that there would be some experienced guides on hand, anxious to earn sixpence by assisting at the rite, as there had been at St. Kevin's Bed. But the tower was deserted, save for ourselves. "Well," said Betty at last, "there's one thing certain. I'm not going away from here until I've kissed that stone. I'd be ashamed to go home without kissing it." "So would I agreed. "But I'd prefer that to hanging head downward over that abyss. Anyway, I won't take the responsibility of holding you by the heels while you do it. Perhaps someone will come up after a while to help." So we looked at the scenery and talked of various things, but all either of us thought about was kissing the stone. And we touched on it incidentally now and then shied away from it, and pretended to think of something else. Presently we heard voices on the stair, and a man and two women emerged on the parapet. We waited, but they didn't approach the stone. They just looked around the landscape, and finally Betty inquired casually if they were going to kiss the Blarney stone. "Kiss the Blarney stone?" echoed the man, who was an Englishman. "I should think not. It's altogether too risky." "But it seems a shame to go away without kissing it," Betty protested. "Yes, it does," the other agreed. "But I was here once before, and I fought that all out then. It's really just a silly old legend, you know. Nobody believes it." Now, to my mind, silly old legends are far more worthy of belief than most things, but it would be folly to say so to an Englishman. So the conversation dropped, and presently he and his companions went away, and Betty and I sat down again, and renewed our conversation. And then again we heard voices, and this time it was two American women, well along in years. They asked us if we knew which was the Blarney stone, and we hastened to point it out to them, and explain the process of kissing it. There were postcards illustrating the process on sale at the entrance, and we had studied them attentively before we came in, so that we knew the theory of it quite well. "We were just sitting here trying to screw up courage to do it," Betty added. The newcomers looked at the stone, and then at the abyss. "Well, I'll never do it," they exclaimed simultaneously, and they contented themselves with throwing a kiss at it. And then they went away, and Betty and I, both rather pale around the gills, continued to talk of ships, and shoes, and sealing wax. But I saw in her eyes that somehow or other she was going to kiss the stone. And then a tall, thin man came up the stair, and he asked us where the stone was. And we showed him, and he looked at it, and then he glanced down into the intervening gulf, and drew back with a shudder. "Not for me," he said. "Not for me." "We've come all the way from America," said Betty, "and we simply can't go away until we've kissed it." "Well, I've come all the way from New Zealand, madam," said the man, "but I wouldn't think for a minute of risking my life like that." "It used to be a good deal more dangerous than it is now," I pointed out, as much for my own benefit as for his. "They used to take people by the ankles and hold them upside down outside the battlement. I suppose they dropped somebody over, for those spikes were put there along the top to stop it. If the people who hold your legs are steady, there really isn't any danger now." The New Zealander took another peep over into space. "No siree," he said. "No siree." But he didn't go away. Instead, he sat down and began to talk, and I fancied I could see in his eyes some such uneasy purpose as I saw in Betty's. And then a boy of 12 or 14 came up. He was evidently native to the neighbourhood, and I asked him if he had ever kissed the stone. "I have, sir, many a time," he said. "Would you mind doing it again, so that we can see just how it is done?" He readily consented, and lay down on his back with his head and shoulders over the gulf, and the New Zealander took one leg, and I took the other. Then the boy reached his hands over his head, and grasped the iron bars which ran down inside the battlement to hold the stone in place. "Now, push me down," he said. My heart was in my mouth as we pushed him down, for it seemed an awful distance, though I knew we couldn't drop him because he wasn't very heavy. And then we heard a resounding smack. "All right," he called. "Pull me up." We pulled him up, and in an instant he was on his feet. "That's all there is to it," he said, and sauntered off. "Hmm," grunted the New Zealander, and sat down again. I gazed at the landscape for a minute or two, my hands deep in my pockets. When I turned around, Betty had her hat and coat off, and was spreading her raincoat on the parapet opposite the stone. "What are you going to do?" I demanded sternly. She sat down in the raincoat, with her back to the abyss. "Come on, you two, and hold me," she commanded. I suppose I might have refused, but I didn't. The truth is, I wanted her to kiss the stone as badly as she wanted to. So I knelt on one side of her, and the New Zealander knelt on the other, and we each grasped an ankle. She groped for the iron bars, found them after an instant, and drew herself toward them. "Now, push me down," she said. We did, and as soon as we heard the smack, we hauled her up again, her face aglow with triumph. It took her some minutes to get her hair fixed, for most of the hairpins had fallen out. When she looked up, she saw that I had taken off my coat. "What are you going to do?" she demanded, in much the same tone that I had used. "I'm going to kiss that stone," I said. "Do you suppose I'd go away now without kissing it? Why, I'd never hear the last of it. Get hold of my legs." And I sat down, keeping my eyes carefully averted from the 120-foot drop. "Oh, but look here," she protested. "I don't know whether I'm strong enough to hold you." "Yes, you are," I said, making sure that there was nothing in my trousers pockets to fall out. "Now then." Just then 4 or 5 Irish girls came out upon the tower, and Betty, stricken with the fear of losing me, asked them if they wouldn't help, and they said they would. So, with 1 man and 4 women holding onto my legs, I let myself over backwards. One doesn't realise how much 2 feet is till one tries to take it backwards. It seemed to me that I was hanging in mid-air by my heels, so I kissed a stone hastily and started to come up. "That wasn't it," protested one of the girls who had been watching me. "You've got to go farther down." So they pushed me farther down, and I saw the smooth, worn stone right before my eyes. "Is this it?" I asked. "Yes," she said. So I kissed it, and in a moment was right side up again. And I don't know when I have felt prouder. And then the New Zealander, his face grim and set, began to take things out of his trousers pockets. "If you people will hold me," he said, "I'll do it too." So we held him, and he did it. Then he and I offered to hold the Irish girls, but they refused, giggling. And as there was nothing more to do on top of that tower, we went down again, treading as if on air, more elated than I can say. That sense of elation endures to this day, and I would earnestly advise everyone who visits Blarney Castle to kiss the stone. I am not aware that I am any more eloquent than I ever was. I bet he never had any real need to kiss it. But to go to Blarney without doing so is, well, it's like going to Paris without seeing the Louvre, or to go to the Louvre without seeing the Winged Victory and the Venus of Milo. Really, there isn't any danger if you have 2 people of average strength holding you. And there isn't even any very great sense of danger, since your back is to the abyss, and you can't see it. My advice is to do it at once, as soon as you get to the top of the tower, without stopping to think about it too long. After that, with a very serene mind, you can look at the view, which is very, very lovely, and explore the ruin, which is one of the most interesting and noteworthy in Ireland. We sat down on a bench just outside the castle entrance to rest after our exertions. There was a young man and woman on the bench, and in about a minute we were talking together. It turned out that they were members of Alexander Marsh's company, then touring Ireland in classical repertoire, and would open in Cork in The Three Musketeers the following evening. I had never heard of Alexander Marsh, but they both pronounced his name with such awe and reverence that I fancied he must be a second Irving, and I said at once that we should have to see the play. We went on to talk about that high-hearted story, which I love, and I noticed a growing embarrassment in our companions. "See here," said the man at last, "you know the book so well and think so much of it, that I'm afraid the play will disappoint you. For one thing, we can't put on Richelieu. The play makes rather a fool of him, and the Catholics over here would get angry in a minute if we made a fool of a cardinal, even on the stage. So we have to call in Roquefort, and leave out the cardinal altogether, which of course spoils the whole point of the plot. It's a pity too, because his robes are gorgeous. Of course, it doesn't make so much difference to people who haven't read the book, and mighty few over here have, but I'm afraid you wouldn't like it." I was afraid so too, so we promised we wouldn't come. And then they went on to tell us about themselves. They were married, it seemed, and were full of enthusiasms and ideals, and they spoke with that beautiful accent so common on the English stage. And he had been to New York once, and for some reason had fared pretty badly there, but he hoped to get to America again. He didn't say why, but I inferred it was because in America he could earn a decent salary, which was probably impossible in the Irish provinces. We left them after a while, and wandered through what is left of the groves of Blarney, and visited the caves in the cliffs under the castle, at one time used for dungeons, into which the McCarthys thrust such of their enemies as they could capture. And then we explored the charming little river which runs along under the cliff, and walked on to Blarney Lake, a pretty bit of water, with more than its share of traditions. For, at a certain season of the year, a herd of white cows rises from its bosom, and feeds along its banks, and it is the home of a red trout which will not rise to the fly. And it was into this lake that the last of the McCarthys cast his great chest of plate, when his castle was declared forfeited to the English. And his spirit keeps guard every night along the shore, and the secret of its whereabouts will never be revealed until a McCarthy is again Lord of Blarney. We walked back to the entrance at last, and had a most delicious tea on the veranda of a clean tea shop there, with gay little stone chatters hopping about our feet, picking up the crumbs. And then we loitered about the quaint little village, and visited the church, set in the midst of a pretty park, and wandered along a road under lofty trees, and were wholly, completely, riotously happy. We had kissed the Blarney Stone.